Hi everyone, Gundam Facts here for a 23rd and brand new episode of our special edition Lore of the Universal Century. Today, we're going back again to the late UC era in an attempt to answer a particular question, which is... Yep, in this video, we are going to explore the history of the first Jupiter Gundam, its mechanical lore, variants, and extract every bit of mechanical knowledge we have on them so far. But let's start by the beginning. What is exactly the Amakusa? Codename EMS-20, the Amakusa was an unmanned prototype mobile suit, created by the Jupiter Empire remnants shortly before the Second Jovian conflict. The first of the so-called Jupiter Gundams, the Amakusa was a high-performance mobile weapon, specially designed to emulate a legendary mobile suit from past times, the original RX-7802 Gundam. To achieve this, the Amakusa, a mobile suit from the miniaturized era, reverted to a size of 18 meters, exactly the same height of the RX-7802, and even more surprising, adopted exactly the same number of verniers and thrusters than its 1-year war inspiration. In terms of weaponry, the inspiration from the RX-78 was even more obvious, as the Amakusa adopted a physical shield instead of a beam shield, another throwback to the original Gundam. This shield, however, was a composite weapon, which mounted a claw on its lower section to crush enemy mobile suits and could deploy and fire what would be called the folding hammer, a demolition spiked ball which was designed from the infamous Gundam hammer. As handled weapon, the Amakusa primary asset was a special beam rifle, which distinguished itself by its high output but also by its firing sound, which was exactly the same sound produced by the original Gundam beam rifle. According to some unused concepts, we know that the Amakusa also inherited special shell bazookas, which were directly inspired by the Gundam Hyper Bazooka and were usually dual-wielded. Now, it wasn't this nostalgic weaponry and features that made the Amakusa a terrifying danger. In fact, the Amakusa was an unmanned mobile suit, but instead of being remotely controlled or piloted by an AI, it was instead manned by a bio brain, an artificial brain which was based off Amuro-Rei's 1-year war identity. This meant that confronting the Amakusa was essentially like confronting Amuro-Rei himself and all of his 1-year war new type tricks and gimmicks, except this time with the latest technology available. The result was a more than deadly design, which could take down an entire platoon, even in miniaturized suits, in less than a minute, and could only hope to be stalemated by new types. Like most Jupiter suits, the Amakusa make use of the cat-style Jovian mono-eye camera system, rotating the mono-eye between each orbits when needed, and thus making the first Jupiter Gundam one of the few canon mono-eye Gundams, as the C-Squid and Espada were sadly labeled as AUC. The Amakusa would successfully start the trend of the Jupiter Gundams, first of the Gundams manufactured outside the Earth sphere, and would serve for many years as an inspiration machine, a living legend for some, a terrifying monster for others. But that's enough spec for today. Let's get to our lore. The year is Universal Century 133. At that time, the warmongering Jupiter Empire had moved to attack Earth, only to be countered by the vigilant organization known as the Crossbone Vanguard, holding the Jovians at bay with its new trump cards, the Crossbone Gundams. Yet, as the war progressed, Crossbone Vanguard ace Zabin Sharu, titular pilot of the Crossbone Gundam X2, grew disillusioned of its own faction and eventually switched sides, defecting to the Jupiter Empire and bringing them the Crossbone X2 as a proof of good faith. After a small sense of torture, Sabine and the X2 officially joined the Jupiter Empire war effort, but before they could be fielded again, the X2 was used in a twisted and unfair gladiatorial fight, being pitted against the Crossbone Vanguard pilot Tobias Aronnax, who had been recently captured. There, to much everyone's dismay, Tobias not just hijacked the Gundam, but eventually fled using the X2 core fighter, essentially leaving the Gundam without core fighter and thus without cockpit. To avoid wasting the opportunity of having a Crossbone Gundam to deploy, the Jupiter Empire engineers soon started working on repairing the X2, using their own technologies and the data they had collected on the Crossbones based on earlier engagements. This eventually led up to the X2 being modified in record time into the machine known as the Crossbone X2 Kai. Among the modifications made, the Jupiter engineers were able to recreate the X-shaped rear thrusters of the Crossbone, but since they didn't master miniaturization as much as the scenery, the original manufacturer of the Crossbone Gundams, the rear pieces were slightly enlarged, which was a downgrade. Even more of a downgrade was that the core fighter was definitely abandoned, and that the X2 Kai would instead be forced to mount a regular cockpit. Nonetheless, the X2 Kai received two significant upgrades, which were that the Jupiter-crafted wing parts of the rear thrusters were more aerodynamically shaped, so more effective in some cases, and that its buster launcher was also enhanced, enabling it to sink light cruisers in a single hit. Once completed, the X2 Kai joined the Jupiter Empire forces, and Sabine in the cockpit dealt serious damage to the Crossbone Vanguard, until the final battle where its lack of core fighter proved to be a deadly flaw, leaving Sabine unable to escape the destruction of his Gundam, killing him. Shortly after, the Jupiter Empire lost the battle, and eventually the First Jovian War. As the Jupiter Empire fragmented, numerous remnants of its army formed, vowed to continue the fight against the Crossbone Vanguard. By UC 136, the Callistolite, now elected president of the Jupiter Sphere, revived the Jupiter Empire, and the remnants of its army slowly started regrouping, reforming the official mobile Jovian forces. However, before the Callisto takeover, some among the remnants had seriously been impressed by the Crossbone Gundams and colluded that, to best them, Jupiter would need to have their own version of the Federation wonder weapon, a Jupiter Gundam. This dream would drag on until early UC 135, where a miracle happened for the Jovians. An old derelict core fighter belonging to a RX-78 mobile suit was discovered by a group of Jupiter remnants, and upon examining it, they almost went frenzied. This core fighter was not just a regular core fighter from a RX-78, it was THE core fighter of the RX-7802, which had once belonged to Amuro Ray, who had used it for a final time after Abawaku, and then left it fly away in space once it reached its friends. This core fighter had then spent almost 60 years slowly drifting in space, before eventually reaching Jupiter, where it had been found. Inside it, the Jovians discovered a goldmine of data about the original Gundam, but even better, they gained access to all of Amuro 1-year war data, his experiences, techniques, and recorded performance. With such data in their hands, the Remnant Group immediately decided to revive the Jupiter Gundam idea, and gives it the best pilot one could ever ask, Amuro Ray. Now, the thing was that Amuro was dead for quite some time, but thanks to the core fighter data, the Jovians engineers had now the means to somehow bring his 1-year war persona out of the grave. The Jovians actually used the Bio Brain technique, which consisted in creating artificial brains and then feed it with imprint memories, this time with all the data collected from the core fighter. This data turn into memories for the Bio Brain, and soon Jupiter gained a brain jar with all of Wanyewu Amuro piloting prowess and gimmicks, without any of Amuro consciousness and morality. Now with the perfect pilot in their sleeve, the Jupiter Empire turned to finally create a high-performance mobile suit for the Bio Brain to pilot, but eventually realized something. The Bio Brain was a replica of Wanyewu Amuro, a pilot who had spent the majority of its existence piloting the original Gundam, and soon the Jupiter Empire decided that, in order to make the Bio Brain effective with the mobile suit it would pilot, it needed to be familiar with it, and the machine would just need to bear a close resemblance with the original Gundam. With this in mind, the Jovian scientists mixed every data they had on the Crossbone X2 Kai and the original Gundam, and by fusing their development, finally obtained the first of the Jupiter Gundams, the Amakusa. For the Amakusa industrial production, the Jupiter Empire used the same assembling lines used for the Batala, its mainstay mobile suit, which meant that in the end, the Amakusa was essentially a non-miniaturized enhanced version of the Crossbone X2 Kai, emulating the RX-7802 and made using Batala parts. Nonetheless, the Amakusa was a resounding success, and after a few tests, it was determined that the machine performance eclipsed any of the three original Crossbone Gundams, with the Bio Brain drastically raising the Amakusa effectiveness as well. Unfortunately, despite all the secrecy surrounding the project, news of it reached an aging Judo Ashita, now known as Greystox, and quickly the veteran pilot investigated the situation, and upon confirming that the Jovians were trying to resurrect and mass-produce Amuro as a Bio Brain, he immediately reached the Crossbone Vanguard remnant for assistance, hoping to gain the support to stop this madness. The Crossbones would respond and would send their flag unit, the Crossbone Gundam X12 Kai, also known as the Skull Earth, alongside the three mass production Crossbone Flints, escorting Greystox and his old Gump. Upon reaching the Amakusa development base, the Crossbone team quickly infiltrated the location, and as a last resort, the base commander was forced to activate the Amakusa, and ironically, unleash the Jupiter Gundam against a squad of 2 Gundams and 3 mass production Gundam-derived mobile suits. This completely turned the tables in favor of the Jovian forces, with the Amakusa easily outmaneuvering the Skull Earth before grounding the Gump and destroying 17 Crossbone Vanguard mobile suits, including all 3 Flints, save for their core fighters. Subsequently, the Amakusa managed to evade an attack from the Peacock Smasher, a powerful salvo from the Skull Earth 9 Battle Beam crossbow, which was an attack considered impossible to avoid except for new types. Nonetheless, as the Amakusa was ready to deal the killing blow to the Crossbone, the Jupiter officers of the base made the tactical mistake of sending out the regular forces to assist the Amakusa. These Jovian allies launched in their Batalas, and because this Jupiter model had been often hijacked by the Crossbone Vanguard during the past conflict, the Bio Brain of the Amakusa assumed these allied Batalas were hijacked units and opened fire, decimating the Jovian forces. Thanks to this destruction, Tobiya and his Crossbone Skullets were able to corner the Amakusa, and using the scissor anchor to redirect the folding hammer, they were able to hit the Jupiter Gundam with its own weapon, destroying its head and crushing the torso. The Crossbone Gundam then swiftly used the beam marker to finish the damaged Amakusa, but was unable to avoid the Bio Brain's escape. As the base started to collapse, the Crossbone recovered the Gump and attempted to flee, only to be buried alive under the collapsing base. At that precise moment, the fleeing Bio Brain, now damaged and in its last moments of life, suddenly achieved consciousness, and using his Amuro new type powers, reached Tobiya, communicating to his enemy how to escape the base. In the end, this proved that despite everything, Amuro's well-natured spirit had been able to resurface somehow in the Bio Brain, saving the life of people who were his enemies mere minutes ago. Following these events, the base and its Bio Brain factory laid in ruin, forcing the Jupiter Empire to abandon the dream of mass-producing Amuro Ray Bio Brains. Nonetheless, under the Callisto-Light presidency, the Amakusa was considered a success, and despite not having Bio Brains to pilot them, Jupiter put the model to mass production, resulting in the creation of the Amakusa mass production type. Changing the color scheme from grey to sand brown, the mass production Amakusa remained mostly unchanged from the prototype, keeping its 18 meters 8 and adopting the same kind of rifle. The physical shield, deemed obsolete, was removed, and the model instead received a beam shield, increasing its overall defenses. Aside that, the MP Amakusa also replaced the Bio Brain container storage by a regular cockpit, enabling Jupiter ground soldiers to pilot the mass-produced Jupiter Gundams. And yet, this proved a bad idea. The Amakusa's real design strength was how close it resembled the RX 7802, and how the Bio Brain of Amuro benefited from this similarity. In the hands of the Jovian grunts, the Amakusa was mostly a non-miniaturized mobile suit deep in the era of miniaturized designs, which high performance could not overcome the new rules of space warfare. During the second Jovian conflict of UC-136, the MP Amakusa suffered heavy casualties, notably during the battle at the Sindri base, where the 3 F-99 record breakers massacred the entire MP Amakusa forces before their leader could turn the table. Later on, the Flint got his revenge for what happened with the original prototype by decapitating a MP Amakusa with a rock throw. Even worse, the MP Amakusa is further shamed later in the manga, where a James Gunn is shown to be able to deal with it. This poor performance resulted in the MP Amakusa being slowly abandoned and instead fall out of use in favor of the weaker but smaller EMS-12 Arana. Nonetheless, the MP Amakusa remained in use, being seen as late as the late UC-160s in the Jupiter sphere. Now, the MP Amakusa seems to draw a bad portrait of the Amakusa legacy, but plenty of other successors would manage to bring pride to the Amakusa line. In early UC-136, the Callisto-Light revived the anti-Crossbone Gundam / Jupiter Gundam project, but this time, the engineers were specifically asked to drop the Gundam elements, instead just focusing into creating the best mobile suits they could to rip the Crossbone Gundam apart. The engineers would then decide to mix the design of the original Amakusa and of the Corvats, one of the suits which had performed the best against the Crossbone Gundam in the first Jovian conflict of UC-133. This fused development resulted in the creation of the EMS-XX Cornix, a high-performance high-mobility mobile suit specifically designed for the Callisto Shadow, Callisto-Light twin brother. With its design resembling a crow, the Cornix was a living nightmare for most mobile suits in the Earthsphere, wielding a super accuracy custom rifle and mounting a beam machine gun in its left hand, and which could also emit a beam talon, enabling the Cornix to literally tear apart enemy mobile suits. From the Corvats, the Cornix inherited a head-high output cannon, which could bypass beam shields, and the suit also inherited a similar high-speed mobile armor form, giving it the nickname of the Bird Mobile Armor. Now, the real strength of the Cornix resided in its variable frame, which enabled the mobile suit to deform itself to switch position between its arms and its legs. This mechanism not only gave the Cornix a bonus of MBAC, but enabled a skilled pilot to make sure the Cornix was too agile to be ever hit by an enemy attack. This is basically what happened in the Cornix first introduction, where the Amakusa spawn bested the 3 F-99 record breakers, evading each of their attacks before picking them one after another. In the same fight, the Cornix vanquished quite easily the Crossbone Skullet, succeeding where the Amakusa had failed, into besting the Crossbone. Later in the manga, the Cornix was enhanced into the Impulse Cornix, receiving supplementary parts to perform correctly in 1G environment, alongside 14 phaser funnels, which were crash course funnels designed to destroy the enemy by ramming them. Unfortunately, the Impulse Cornix fell for a trap of the Crossbone Gundam and its allies, and after a long and fiery duel, the repaired version of the Skullet, the Crossbone Patchwork, finally defeated the Callisto Shadow on the Cornix, bringing down the terrifying threat they represented. Despite the Cornix destruction, the Amakusa lineage was still highly regarded in Jupiter, and roughly 15 years later, the 1000 Costume Initiative of the now rebranded Jupiter Republic used the design of the first Jupiter Gundam as a base for 2 out of the 10 mobile suits of the project. For the first one, labeled TC-02, the project engineers mixed design elements from the Amakusa and from stolen data of the F-99 record breaker in an attempt to create a Jupiter-made Minovsky-drive equipped mobile suit, resulting in the birth of the EMS TC-02, nicknamed Phantom. A suit designed to carry blitzkrieg attack in the Earth sphere and then quickly retreat to Jupiter, the Phantom was supposed to be the crown jewel of the project, wielding a Minovsky drive, new weapons, a mobile armor form named the Mirage Oiseau, and even a biocomputer. Due to its dual origins, the Phantom ran with 2 operating systems, an Amakusa-based one and a F-99-derived one, but because of the poor retro engineering, only the Amakusa-based one was accessible, resulting in the Phantom being unable to activate. Aside this, the Phantom cumulated other problems due to the poorly reproduced Minovsky drive, resulting in the suit being deemed a failure and being sealed away. Since the Phantom is one of my favorite suits and has a dense lore, I am not going to explicit everything here, but know that it was hijacked by Phonebound, the protagonist of Crossbone Ghost, who managed to resolve the cat cradle needed to activate the F-99 OS. Subsequently, Font brought the Phantom to Serpentail, renaming it Phantom Gundam before adopting it as his personal suit, eventually resulting in the Phantom becoming a fully fledged Gundam after being repaired with Crossbone X1 and X2 parts, becoming the second Jupiter Gundam, the Ghost Gundam. 16 years later in UC 169, the Ghost, now reverted into the Phantom V2, continued its journey, proving that the Amakusa family fused development with the F-99 had succeeded in the long run. But let's go back to UC 153. For the second suit, labeled TC-04, the Tokus Initiative recycled the bodily design of the Amakusa, notably the internal structure, and miniaturized it, making it the base for the EMS TC-04, aka the Dephys. A close-range specialized model, the Dephys was essentially a mobile suit-sized boogeyman with Freddy Krueger inspirations, using its long beam fangs to literally disembowel enemy models, all this while retaining mid-range abilities through end-beam guns, and equally versatile defensive abilities, being able to spin the fangs to create beam rotors look-alikes. Unlike the Phantom, the Dephys was fully operational, and soon became the figurehead of the Tokus mobile suits until its pilot switched sides following the Phantom activation, and eventually joined the protagonist faction. Now, we know the Dephys is inspired by the Amakusa, but by the shape of its legs, it seems also to be inspired by the Cornix, a characteristic shared with another Tokus mobile suit, the EMS-TC-03 Bailarina. This would mean that while 2 of the Focus mobile suits are direct Amakusa spawns, 3 of them are actually Amakusa descendants. Beyond the original Focus, the Amakusa legacy continued for years, notably with the Phantom, Dephys and Bailarina being mass-produced in one form or another. Yet, the most recent resurrection of the Amakusa happened in the latest Crossbone installment, Crossbone X11. In the late UC 160s, the Jupiter Republic, now having recovered the Crossbone X0, attempted to mass-produce it, and after manufacturing the plagiated version, the Crossbone X11, they attempted to recreate the X0 with only their own technologies, which resulted in the creation of Kirby, joking, the Crossbone X12. The third official Jupiter Gundam, the X12 actually reintroduced many Amakusa design elements, notably its legs, which were merely miniaturized and pink-painted Amakusa legs. Sadly for the Amakusa reputation, the X12 would be pitted against the X11, and mirroring how the original Amakusa had once lost against the X1 Skullet, the X12 ended up being defeated, ending the story of the Amakusa line, at least for now. And we have now completed today's topic, and I hope you will like it. This will be all for today's video, but stay tuned for future lore content delivered on the same channel. Hit the like button, and most importantly, comment and subscribe as it will really help the channel to flourish. So long fellow new types, until the time of our next special edition.